technically at 9:30 yet. So if you want to fellowship a little longer, I won't hold it against you. That's okay. I won't wake you up. Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7 is where we're going to be this morning. Good morning, everybody. How y'all doing today? You staying dry? As best you can? All right, so this morning, as we look into Acts chapter 7, our letter of the alphabet for chapter 7 is the letter G, and that stands for Great Sermon by Stephen. Great Sermon by Stephen. And at the end of this class, I'll give you a bookmark with all of these on them for every chapter. That way you can keep up with it and remember what each chapter represents, and it's really there for us to be able to take and to remember pretty quickly what happens in the chapter. And so each description of the alphabet is really there to jog our memory, to help us think about it and to remember it without having to remember and recall every single verse specifically. But we can, oh yeah, that's what took place in chapter 7. And so in chapter 6, very briefly, remember some will call it the first deacons. They're not called deacons, but really they are servants. But they're very specific, right? There's qualifications that must be met. They're picked out. And so in Acts chapter 6, you have these men called to step up because there were widows that were neglected and among their own people. And the apostles were trying to preach the gospel to those that were lost. And so they didn't, and this sounds bad, but they were basically saying we don't have the time to do that and to take care of these widows, but we also don't want the widows to go neglected. So here's our solution. We can continue doing our job if you can find men that fit these qualifications, that meet these qualifications, appoint them to serve, and then they can make sure these needs are taken care of. And we can continue to do what we are here to do. And so you kind of can see right there as the early church is beginning, here's the church is beginning and growing, you see how they're establishing these men in this situation as leaders to step up and take care of some of these situations. Just like recently we appointed new deacons here to step up and to oversee some things, and I know that they're going to be talking about, which person's going to be over this or that or the other coming up, but that just allows the elders to focus on some things that are more important, truthfully, for their time. And that's what it was here. It wasn't that benevolence was unimportant. It's that the most important thing was the lost being taught the truth. And they could do that if this other part was taken care of by members. So, again, you have to have a congregation where everybody is stepping up to do their part and to help the congregation thrive. Just like Paul describes it in 1 Corinthians 12 as a body, and you and I think of our physical bodies and the importance of each member of our physical body and how every part is unique but important and special. All those things matter. And same is true for the church. Every single person matters. The person that has been a member here for 60 years matters. And the person that's been a member here for 60 days matters. The visitor that's coming to visit Central and find a church home, they matter. Every person matters to Jesus, and every person matters in the work of the church. And so all this is happening in chapter 6. And then in at the last half of chapter 6 is where Stephen is accused of blasphemy. And then chapter 7 is where he actually preaches this sermon. That's why for the letter G, the ABCs of Acts, chapter 7's G, so it's Great Sermon by Stephen. That's the one that it stands for. And we're going to look at this sermon today and talk about what he talks about, and of course look at the conclusion of the sermon. But there's a lot of verses here, so instead of reading all these verses, if you've got if you filled out your notebook, I think we're going to kind of start approaching class a little bit different than what I've been trying to do, and I think we're just going to kind of talk through the workbook together each week, and then I'll have some side notes to add into it. But I bought you these workbooks. Time out. I did not buy you these workbooks. The church got you these workbooks for class, and so I want us to follow through these and help them be aids to our discussion and kind of points along the way to stop and discuss. So you have the high priest in verse 1 said, "Are these things so?" So he's asking this question, are these things really so? And this is where Stephen preaches. He says, "Brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran." Now, some scholars, some people, not scholars, but I guess some people will be accused by these modern skeptics of making a mistake by saying Abraham received his call in Mesopotamia. But he clarifies here at the beginning that this is not the second call he receives in Genesis chapter 12. This is before. This is when he's still in this area, before he goes to Haran, right? So Stephen's referring to the first call from God by the fact Abraham came out of the land of the Chaldees, or the Chaldeans, to Haran in Hebrews 11 and verse 8. And then chapter 12, verse 1 is where you see this second call to go to a land that I will show you, right? I want you to go now, and I'm going to bless the nations through your seed. And so Stephen is preaching and talking about Abraham. Now, I kind of gave you an answer, but the first question there says, where and when did God appear to Abraham? Mesopotamia, right? The first time. That's where he appears to Abraham. And what and who was Abraham required to leave? His company. So what would that be? Family, right? Now, he takes his wife with him, right? They don't have children yet, but overall, he's to leave. We say company, but really, isn't he to leave everything? Overall, he takes his wife, and Lot goes with him, right? But you have this situation where when you leave a place where you've lived, I don't know, possibly his entire life, at his age, what would he be leaving behind? Other family members that are not his wife or his nephew Lot, right? But what else? Possessions. He has a house. Right? He's not going to pick up the house and take it. So he's got a house he's leaving behind, which means the possessions in a house. What else? He more than likely had a job, so he'd be leaving behind a profession. So think of it this way. If you were in his shoes today, all right, you're wearing Abraham's sandals, and God calls you to leave everything you know and go to a land that he will show you. You take your wife, your husband, your children, right? What would you be leaving behind, though? Now, some of you might be like, well, I've got an RV, so not in my house, right? But what you'd be leaving behind friends that aren't going on the trip with you. What else? Your house, all the possessions in your house that you don't deem necessary and that you can take, right? That'll fit in luggage or in your pocket or whatever. Your culture, maybe, depending on where you're going. You know, what if you think of those that go into the mission field out of this country, right? We talk constantly about how this country is a mission field, and sadly, I wonder if at times we get so concerned about the mission field across the seas that we forget about the mission field here. And this mission field is just as important as the others, right? Remember, mission work doesn't require us to cross the seas, but to see the cross. And when we see the cross, we realize that wherever we are is our mission field. That's where we're called to be. Now, I might never have the opportunity to go to Africa, right? But there are missionaries in Africa who are preaching the gospel and teaching the lost, and there are churches being planted. And there are missionaries in China and in other countries that you want to list, right? There are these missionaries in these other places. So that allows them to do their job. But what if an American decides, you know what, I really want to go to China and teach the truth. That's a whole different culture. And this whole freedom of religion thing that you enjoy in America, it's kind of flipped on its head when you go to China and you're trying to teach people Christianity. So there's just, it helps to stop and think about what Abraham really left behind. Everything except his wife. Yes. They don't have internet. Yeah. Yeah, you know, there wasn't internet, right? So there wasn't Facebook for those of us that use it appropriately to keep up with each other. And hey, the positive note, there wasn't Facebook for people to get on there and say things they shouldn't. But in terms of, you think today, well, I'd leave behind my friends, but at least I could keep in touch. I got a cell phone, I got social media. They didn't have those things. And so there's a lot going on here that in this call to leave for God, which again is a testament to the faith of Abraham. And interestingly enough, God still felt the need for Genesis chapter 22 to happen. Despite this faith to leave everything, what happens in Genesis 22? Just as a sidebar. Hey, Abraham, the son of promise, I want you to offer him as a burnt offering. Right? His faith was still being tested. We never reach a point where the testing of our faith is unproductive or is not something that could be beneficial for us. We always should strive to grow in our faith. And when we meet resistance in that growth, it's a great opportunity to grow stronger. Now, it's also a possibility to regress or to turn away from, as some do. But if you remember the promises of God and you trust in those, then when you meet that opposition, that resistance, and this storm of life that we live through, then you find the strength to persevere through it, and your faith is stronger after it. You know, I think it's important to remember that all through Scripture, I see Jesus saving more people through the storm than from the storm necessarily, right? He gets you through it. You're going to go through the storms. It's not that He's going to save you from ever having to experience storms in your life. But it's just something to think about there. So he's talking about Abraham's call to leave everything that he'd ever known and go to a land that he did not know. And what was the name of the land Abraham left in verse 4? Or the land of the Chaldeans. And where's he going to dwell now? Haran or Haran, right? And from there, of course, his father's going to pass away, and that's when he moves from there to continue on this progression towards the promised land. When God promised Abraham his descendants would inherit Canaan, did he have any children at that point in time? Not yet, right? Verse 5, when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession. So without children, which that's why God comes through with this promise. Now, how long would Abraham's descendants be in bondage? 400 years. Okay. Think about the information that Abraham's taken in through this, and think about the descendants and what they go through, and it's hard to fathom a lot of this in our microwave culture. It's hard to think about God promising Abraham a son, but then him having to wait 25-ish years to have a son of promise, isn't it? Now, he thinks that he's supposed to have one through his handmaiden, right? You have Hagar, but ends up not being what God meant, right? No, you're going to have a son through Sarai, your wife. And so it's not Ishmael that we're talking about, it's Isaac. And so Abraham's waiting this period of time. You think of the prophet Jeremiah when he prays to God, and it says he waits 10 days before he ever gets an answer. You think of all the times where God promises and follows through, but not immediately. And today, we mistake God's silence for God's absence, and those things are not the same thing. God's silence does not mean no necessarily. God's silence might mean not yet. God's silence could mean no, but we don't know. Typically we find out, don't we? When it clicks later on, I get it now. As we remind ourselves, God answers prayers based off our needs, so it's going to be on His timetable and on our needs. So it's pretty, you should be thankful for that part, but the timetable thing is where we're kind of like, no, God, today's culture, we get things now. Like I Google it and I know it, right? Or I put it in the microwave and I got popcorn. Or I got heated up pizza. I got fast meals. I can go through a drive-through. Sometimes I have to wait in line, but hey, these drive-throughs, they're getting it together. So you think of all this stuff today, and patience is a virtue that I think maybe eludes a lot of us today. I'm guilty, right? Don't pray for patience. God will give you kids. Yes. Yeah. No, we don't. And when we have opportunities to grow in our patience, but then we also have ways to skip around that. And instead of choosing to try to grow in our patience, we just choose to get frustrated because it's not there right then. But Abraham promised a son because he has none. His descendants are going to be in bondage 400 years. And the covenant that God gives to Abraham and his descendants is what? What does he say? Okay, so there's going to be this circumcision, right? And they'll dwell in a land for 400 years. The nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. And the covenant, verse 8. Now, it's mistaken here because it says verse 6. It should say verse 8 in your notebooks. But it's the covenant of circumcision. So that's why it probably is a little confusing. But verse 8. He gives them a covenant of circumcision. So Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs, and so on. So Stephen's sermon, isn't it interesting that as he's preaching to these individuals, where does he begin? At the beginning. Now, not of creation, but at the beginning of this moment where God is talking about having a people in this world, right? He gives Abraham the covenant, and this is the beginning of the covenant between God and His people. So sometimes when you talk to someone about faith in Jesus, where do we need to begin? The beginning. Where should we always begin? It's a trick question, kind of, but where should we always begin when we're talking to someone about our faith, about Jesus, about Christianity, about the church? Where they are. That's where we should always begin. Because if you're talking to someone who has no faith in the Bible being the Word of God and you're trying to use the Bible to prove it's the Word of God, it gets really tough. And so you got to use the Bible, and you got to find other things that can kind of help them get to a place. Because if they don't believe in the Bible, then anything you show them in the Bible about Jesus, why would they necessarily believe that if you can't get them first to trust the Bible? If they don't believe in God, then you don't need to be talking about that Jesus died for them. You need to go back and make sure they understand who God is. That's exactly the example we have with Philip and the eunuch, right? He began where he was at that same scripture, and then he did the next thing we need to do, which is wherever they are, start there and preach Jesus to them. Talk to them about Jesus. Have that conversation. So, he starts at the beginning. He talks about Abraham. Now, where's he going to go next after Abraham? He said, Abraham, there's this covenant of circumcision, so Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. Then where does he go after that? What's the next step? Verse 9. Right, Joseph. So he's talking about these patriarchs. And so he says, and the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt. So, looking back at our books here, which, by the way, I think I'm going to order about 10 more books. So if you don't have a book, I'll have them for you, Lord willing, Sunday. If not, I'll have them next Wednesday. Okay? So not this Wednesday, but a week from this Wednesday at the latest. They get here pretty quick, especially since I'm only going to order about 10 this time. But if they don't have all of them in stock, that's when we have to wait. So I'm going to order 10 because whatever we don't need in here, we can put in the library for someone to have at some point, and I know that it'll be a blessing to them. So, so if you don't have one, don't worry. I'll have some with me to give to you, and then we can keep going through these together. But why did Joseph's brothers sell him into Egyptian slavery here? They were jealous. They were envious. Now, one thing I will say is a lot of times I wonder if we come to this story of Joseph and his brothers and we really think that Joseph was completely innocent in the matter. Was he? And I'm not saying he deserved to be sold into Egyptian slavery, but do you ever wonder if maybe at times, hey, Joseph, here's this special gift that none of my other sons have. And Joseph's like, hey, guys, look what Dad gave me, right? I don't know if he did that, but as a kid, he might have meant it innocently. But if you constantly are reminded that, well, Dad loves him more. We always ask parents, who's your favorite child? Like, I don't have one. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's things in the story of Joseph and his brothers where you can see that maybe Joseph sometimes had to be a little more conscientious of how he said things or what he said. Again, none of what he did or said ever warranted what happened to him being done, right? But it's not that he was just this completely never poked, or did anything. I'm sure his brothers got tired of all that. They obviously didn't handle it right. But his brothers sell him into Egyptian slavery because they're envious. They want that. Whether that's the relationship with their father, whether that's getting these visions from God and having that kind of connection with God, and also that kind of promise in a vision, like those kinds of things wore on them to the point where they did something very unwise and very wrong. So that envy led to them selling their own brother into slavery. And envy today can lead to a lot of wrong in our lives. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, not all being from the same mother and that culture that they had, and I'm sure there was animosity. There was, well, maybe he's the favorite because this is his mother, and so that's his favorite, of all the mothers of the children. This is the one. I don't know. There's just, be careful that your kids don't step back and look and think that you love one of your children more than the other, and just. Those of you that had multiple children, you get that. Those of you that were one of multiple children growing up, you get that. But it's something to remind us younger parents to make sure that we're not unintentionally showing a child that I love you, but I love your brother or your sister more, right? They didn't put a popcorn kernel up their nose. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. Maybe that's a callback here to the story of Joseph and his family. I was preaching one time about Joshua. I can't remember if it was about Joshua. It was about Joshua or Joseph, the sermon was. But the statement came out, Joshua, and, his father gave him the coat of many colors. And I just misspoke, and sure enough, one of the teenagers came up to me after. He's like, actually, it was Joseph. I said, actually, I know, but thank you. It was really funny. The kids listen a lot more than you think. But maybe this whole situation with Joseph and the many colors, and the coat of many colors, and just that growing up, maybe that is one of the reasons you see a passage like what we have in the New Testament about fathers provoking not your children to wrath, but stir them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, and train them to serve God and to love God. Yeah. Yeah. So he's one of the youngest, Joseph is, and the brother that stood up for him was one of the oldest. And so there's a lot there. It's a powerful story, right? And you, of course, you have the ending of it that's very powerful. But Miss Sybil, did you want to say something? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yes, we have to learn how to take responsibility for our actions in a culture where no one wants to. And it's not new, right? Because you have, Adam and Eve. No one wanted to take responsibility there, but sure wanted to give it to someone else. And it happened then, and it's happened all throughout Scripture, all throughout time, where it's someone else's fault. And that's one of the reasons, perhaps, where we can't grow in our faith, because until we can acknowledge what is a lot of the sayings. If you go to these different kinds of meetings or things, what do they say? The first step is what? Admitting there's a problem. And until you admit there's a problem, then you're not really going to be able to get the help you need, because you're going to continue to deny it and place the blame other places. And until you can accept the blame, there can be no moving forward. Just like we talked about last week in the sermon, a reminder of Jacob wrestling with God, right? And how up until that point he had deceived his father, he had deceived his own brother to get his birthright, and up until that point where they wrestle in Genesis chapter 32, you see God constantly referred to as the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, not the God of Jacob. That happens when God's speaking. That happens when Jacob's speaking. Jacob even says that. He claims that God isn't his God. But after the wrestling match in Genesis 33, what do you see? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, right? Because after that wrestling match happens, God, in that, he's asked the question, who are you? And when he says, I am Jacob, that statement to me is more than just like if you said, what's your name? And I said, oh, I'm Cody. I don't think that is what's being said. In saying, I am Jacob, it seems, if you read all the chapters leading up to chapter 32, that's a moment of ownership of all the wrong he's done. Because what's he been doing the entire time? Pretending. Wearing a mask of someone else. Literally putting fur on his arms to trick his father, who's losing his eyesight, to think that he's the brother that's hairy, right? In Esau. And so, going with what Miss Sybil said, I think that's a powerful passage in ownership to some degree. To say I am Jacob is where he's kind of taken that mask off finally and saying, I'm the guy that's deceived my father on his deathbed. I'm the guy that deceived my brother and tricked him to get his birthright. I took advantage in a moment of weakness. I'm the one that's done all this wrong. And then God says, not anymore. Your name, from now on, your name is Israel. And the same is true for us. Until we take off the mask and stop pretending and stop being hypocrites and stop placing blame other places or on other people, we will never have a moment to enjoy and trust in the blessings of God and to fulfill our calling to what God's called us to be and to do. But if we can find the courage, because it takes courage, to admit, I'm Jacob, then God will help us to grow from that point forward. We then can begin healing and growing. And so I thank Ms. Sybil for that comment. Those are good comments and very important for us to think about. And these men, these brothers, they're not 10-year-olds, right? They're not little kids. Same thing with David. A lot of times we think of David and Goliath, and we think he was just this little old boy. Well, if he was a little 12-year-old boy, why in the world would Saul think his armor would fit him? Right? Because he tries to put his armor on him first before he fights Goliath. So he's not a little boy. The wording there in the Hebrew is a little more confusing than just our simple English wording, right? And so David's older than that. I'm not saying he's 30 or 40, but he's more of like a young man or young adult kind of thing. He's not this little boy. And the same is true here. These aren't just little boys that, oh, well, we shouldn't have done that. They're young men that should have known better. And so he starts here, talks about Abraham. Now he gets to Joseph and being sold into slavery. They sold him because they were envious, verse 9. Now, question number 9. What did God do for Joseph? Okay, so number 1, he delivered him. What else? Okay, gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. That's talking about Pharaoh making him governor, right? Because you have that little h that kind of lets us know we're talking about someone that's not deity, it's not God. So, for Joseph, God gave him deliverance and gave him favor and wisdom in the eyes of Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt. So God takes care of Joseph. Why did Jacob send Joseph's brothers to Egypt? Okay, so there's a drought, there's famine, they need grain. He heard there's grain in Egypt, so hey, go get grain out of Egypt and bring it back. Where did Jacob and his sons end up dying? Where? In Egypt, right? What happens before they die, though? They're sent to Egypt, and then, Cliff Notes version, what happens once the brothers of Joseph get there? Go back to your text, okay? What does it say? Verse 13, the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to the Pharaoh. So, Joseph, there's a moment where Joseph does reveal himself in his position with Pharaoh to his brothers, right? And there's kind of this moment of what? Reconciliation? Forgiveness? If you had been sold into slavery, now think of it too, God took care of Joseph, right? But still, the reality that you were sold into slavery by your own family, the ones that are supposed to love you, how would you respond when you see them again for the first time? Or the second time, or the third? Yeah, right? He wanted to see their responses, and he kind of tricked them a little bit. But upon the reveal, you know, of course, a lot of times pass, so there seems to be regret. There's forgiveness offered. There's a lot to take away from that for us today when we're wronged by those that are closest to us and that we love. Doesn't mean that there's not hurt or pain, but there is this importance of forgiveness. And remember, when God talks about forgiveness in His Scriptures, it's just as much for the person asking or seeking that forgiveness as it is for you, the one doing the forgiving. Because the longer that we withhold forgiveness, the more we carry around that burden and that weight. And so when we find the strength to forgive, we let go of that, and we stop being weighed down by that. So
Joseph did that in a lot of ways. When he first saw him, he recognized him. He knew
Yep.
who they were. And yet, as Pat said, he kind of held off.
Mm-hmm.
He put him in prison.
Yeah.
He watched them. You might say he watched them. He had the servants go back after they left. And the servants go back and stop them and turn them around. And so he had, in one sense, he had an opportunity to get some of that. You could say, we don't read it, his anger or frustration maybe came out a little bit.
Yeah.
But he also loved them enough, and when he found out, or when they was told that his father was still alive, he wanted to be reunited with all.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you think about it. Now, there are some that, like we were talking about a minute ago, that refuse to accept blame. But then there are others that accept blame that's not even their own blame to accept. And so he might have found some things that he could truthfully say, I could have done this better, that better. But that is a natural human response, too, to say, this probably is my fault, even in moments when it might not be. But you think about all, like Eric was saying, we say, well, let's talk about the story of Abraham or the story of Noah and the ark and the story of David and Goliath. And a lot of times with that word story, there might be attached to it unintentionally this thought like it's a children's book or it's a book you pick up at the library and it's this fictional fake story that, it just sounds good. But these are all stories, yes, but they're all really more, maybe accurately, accounts. These are things that happened, not just a story. It's just like when you take accounts in the Bible and we, I don't know how to say this word. I'm going to create my own word. I'm just trying to decide which one I want to create. We childify or kidify them. For example, we take David and Goliath and we bring it down to the level of children so we can tell them the story of VBS. Or we take Jonah and the big fish, which again, he's in like 2, maybe 3 verses tops in the whole book of Jonah, but it's called Jonah and the big fish, right? You take that and we take it and bring it down to the VBS level, and sometimes as adults, we forget to adjust and bring those stories, those accounts back to real life and what was actually going on in those moments. How David actually took a giant sword and cut off Goliath's head. Remember that part of the story? We kind of stop there, or we say it really fast, hope the kids don't pick up on it, but I guarantee you all the little boys are like, oh, what? Read that again, right? But there's these moments in these stories, or Noah and the ark, great story. Yes, you can talk about it, and there's nothing wrong with bringing it down to the level of kids and helping them be able to understand. But as you get older, don't forget to bring it with you into your adulthood. Because in Noah and the ark, it's not just he built the ark and he floated on the water, but what about all the people that didn't get on the ark? Yeah. 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 It is. There has to be that point where there's a shift. God cannot be my God because he is the God of my mom and dad, or the God of my grandparents, or the God of my wife, or the God of anyone else. He has to be my God. Now, there is obviously, as God's people, God is our God. But there is a personal aspect of faith when it comes to our relationship with God. Each of us, while we as a community have a relationship with God, we also each individually have relationships with God. And until God becomes your God, it's going to be tough. And that's one of the challenges you have with young people, right? Not every kid is going to go to college in their hometown or close to their hometown. Not every kid is going to go to a Christian college, right? For various reasons. Maybe they don't have the degree they want to pursue. Maybe it's just too much money because they're not cheap. There's various reasons, right? So, how do we help our kids stay faithful when they leave home? We have along the way, we have to find ways as parents and then as the congregation secondly, right? Parents first, because you're the ones at home with your children. Then as a congregation, we have to find ways to help our kids get from a place where they're here because their parents made them come to they're here because God is their God and they're here, they love God. Now, it doesn't happen when they turn 18 necessarily, but we've got to help them in that journey so they realize it's not just about being here because my parents made me come. Because if that's the only reason and they're never helped along the way to understand why, then they go to college and their parents aren't there to make them go. So it gets easier to miss here or there. And if you miss here or there, it gets easier to miss everywhere, right? To be Dr. Seuss for a moment. So you think of our kids, it's always been challenging. But technology and the culture we're in today, and the things taught in schools that are public schools, and it's tough to parent. But we have to find ways to help our kids understand the importance of what we do and why we do it. Understand the importance of who God is and help them learn how to think for themselves in a healthy way, right? All right. we're not even going to get near the end. But quickly, where were they buried? Verse 16. They're carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. So they're carried back to Shechem to be buried. All right, so that kind of takes us to Moses. So you see his thought processes here in this sermon. Let's talk about Abraham. All right, now we'll shift and let's talk about when the actual 12 tribes get here. Let's talk about these people. And we'll talk about Joseph for a moment and his father and his brothers selling him into slavery. And then he shifts from there, and where does he go? Moses. That's where we'll be next week. So make sure your questions are filled out for Moses and the following verses here through chapter 7. And we are going to look at the discussion questions. There's 3 at the bottom of the page, so take some time to think about those and answer those as well. Appreciate y'all being here. There are handouts for the sermon in both lobbies. Remember, as we've said each week now, be sure to try to meet someone you've not met before today. And if you've met them before, meet them again and get to know them better. So meet somebody new today. Say hello to someone and make them feel welcome. Thank you for being here. We'll see you again in a few moments.
Things wise and wonderful.